think we're ready to begin. Good evening and welcome to this, the fourth evening of our Just Peacemaking conference this year. Under the banner Human Rights, Thwart, Terrorism, I'm Jacob Cook, the Associate Director of the Just Peacemaking Initiative and one of your hosts for this evening. This year's conference has featured and will continue to feature scholars from the U.S. and international communities, representing both Christian and Muslim faith commitments, all wrestling with the U.S. tradition of human rights and how promoting human rights, along with religious liberty, work to heal the sources of terrorism, something that war making cannot do. Our conference will conclude tomorrow night with Jonathan Rothschild. You can get a little more information about him off of the schedule in the lobby. The last 3 nights' conferences are currently available online, so if you haven't been with us, you can check those out at justpeacemaking.org/conference. And ultimately, you'll be able to find those on YouTube. Later in the fall, we'll be hosting 2 more speakers under the same theme, bringing in a Jewish voice in Mark Gopen from George Mason University, and giving voice to another international context in Bernie Adni, who teaches and ministers in Indonesia. If you want more information about the initiative, this conference, upcoming events, that kind of thing, you can visit our website, justpeacemaking.org. And we're on Twitter and Facebook too, and post things there from time to time. Don't feel bad about going right now on your smartphone or computer to like or follow those. A couple of procedural points about tonight. You'll see cameras around. We're actually live streaming tonight's event to friends at regional campuses and followers around the world. So this means 2 things. One, when we get to the question and answer session, if you could speak clearly into one of the microphones in the aisleways, our friends at home will be able to hear you. And 2, if they have questions that they want to ask, they can live chat those to me on the computer, and I'll voice them through a microphone myself. So that said, the Q&A session will be recorded, but won't make its way to YouTube. So if you are second thinking a question that you asked or something later in the night, you don't have to worry about that living on forever. So without any further ado, I'll turn you over to our moderator for this evening, Evelyn Risache.
Welcome. Tonight we are very honored to have a speaker whose scholarship, vast erudition, and profound knowledge of human rights and Islamic law makes him eminently qualified to address the theme of this week's conference, Human Rights, Thwart, Terrorism. His talk tonight is entitled What the U.S. Tradition of Human Rights Means to Muslims. After graduating with a BA from Yale, Juris Doctor from the University of Pennsylvania, and a PhD in Islamic Studies from Princeton, our distinguished speaker joined UCLA faculty, where he holds the position of the Omar and Esmeralda Alfi Professor of Law and teaches, among other subjects, Islamic law, immigration, human rights, international and national security law. He also chairs the Islamic Studies Department at UCLA and teaches Islam and citizenship at the University of Tilburg in the Netherlands. Our speaker was awarded the University of Oslo Human Rights Award, the Leo and Liesl Eitinger Prize, and named a Carnegie Scholar in Islamic Law. He is involved in many human rights organizations. He served on the U.S. Commission for International Religious Freedom and is a member of the Board of Directors of Human Rights Watch. Our speaker is also an accomplished Islamic jurist and scholar, having received 13 years of systematic instruction in Islamic jurisprudence, grammar, and eloquence in Egypt and Kuwait. He has appeared on national and international television and radio, has published widely in such publications as the New York Times, Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, Los Angeles Times, Boston Review, and many others. He is a prolific writer, the author of more than 14 books and several forthcoming, over 50 articles on various topics of Islam and Islamic law. His most recent works focus on authority, human rights, democracy, and beauty in Islam and Islamic law. His book, The Great Theft, was named one of the top 100 books of the Year by Canada's Globe and Mail. His work has been translated into numerous languages, including Arabic, Persian, French, Norwegian, Dutch, Ethiopian, Russian, Japanese, among others. My fellow colleagues and students who read your books and discuss them in classes are deeply honored that you accepted the invitation to come to our campus and offer your insights into the theme of human rights. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming our speaker, Dr. Khaled Abou El Fadl.
Thank you. Thank you very much for this generous introduction. Thank you for your hospitality and your invitation and for coming tonight. Tomorrow you have a speaker who I would have loved to attend because I've read his book about divine commands and it's a fascinating text. Anyway, I was quite intrigued by the invitation and the sort of labeled topic of human rights and human rights as a way of resisting, thwarting, undermining, preventing terrorism. I gained it finally clicked for me actually just minutes ago when I heard Professor Stassen talking about what the Just Peace Initiative, 10 principles of just peace practice are. And the link and the idea of peacemaking. As you well know, we theoreticians of theologians, jurists, people who write about faith and study faith, have written a great deal about war and when we should or should not make war. But peace has not received the same type of attention. And the challenge ultimately is, especially for people of faith, or say theologians and jurists, is to what extent can they really bring coherent moral principles to a situation that does not presumptively assume the existence of a conflict. Put differently, peace is not just in terms of this social reality or political reality, but it's an inner reality as well. And it's so remarkably amorphous and challenging, but it is well worth a challenge. Let me go back to the focus of human rights and terrorism and my thoughts about using one. Immediately, the first thought that, in my opinion, ought to come to one is both are grand concepts. Human rights, a grand concept of good, nearly ultimate good, a claim of absolute good. In many ways, like the idea of divinity, or like the idea of light as opposed to its opposite. Terrorism, on the other hand, an ultimate concept and a grand concept and a concept of evil, ultimate evil, very much the antithesis of divinity and the antithesis of light, the opposite of. Now, the dynamic between the two, although we human beings, theologians, jurists, philosophers, whatever you want to call it, academicians, produce a remarkable variety of terminology to negotiate our idea of good and our repulsion towards the idea of evil. Ultimately, we keep going back to this central dichotomous theme. A theme that for people of faith makes perfect sense because it's the theme, the sense, or the logic, or the rationale of being in a state of grace versus being in a state of absence of grace, or state of blessing versus absence of blessing, state of mercy, if I use my own tradition, versus the absence of mercy. Now, having said this, we also know that the real challenge for people of faith, and probably the motivator, the subconscious, not very subconscious, but subconscious at some level, trigger that inspired me to accept this invitation is the idea of the seminary students struggling with the same dynamic but under different labels, contemporaneous labels. And as seminary students, and as all theologians know, that as powerfully liberating the idea of the good, the light, the divine is, and as remarkably suffocating and deadly as the idea of the evil, the dark, the demonic, the terror-filled or terror-inducing, is that we human beings have been have enjoyed a miserable record of taking a concept of the ultimate and the absolute and rendering in practice its opposite. And that, and I'll elaborate upon that in a second, is the real challenge to the contemporary, to people of faith through the contemporary notion of human rights. I'll explain this in a second. Human rights, their emergence, and to simplify and pass over a lot of complications, it is fair to say that their genesis were in the natural rights tradition, which in turn, its genesis was in the natural law tradition. Very much like the Christian world and the Islamic world, in the Islamic intellectual tradition, there was an earlier conflict, an earlier intellectual battle being led in the Islamic world between those who believed that the notion of right or wrong exists primordially in a primordial and transcendent essence, and that it was not dependent on a divine command, and those who made the locus of the existence of natural right what they used to call al-husn versus al-qubh. Husn means beauty, qubh ugliness, very much like the idea of dark and light, making the genesis of it the existence of the divine command and not anything beyond the divine command. These two factions battle it out throughout Islamic history, and as often happens, eventually both factions are completely swept by the political trends of the day. What I mean is that at the height of the Islamic civilization, at the height of its resting on its laurels of power, Muslim theologians, especially theologians of natural law and natural rights, thrived in Baghdad, Damascus, later on, about a century later in Egypt, and and this is ultimately, if you're curious, the tradition that eventually makes itself through Andalusia to Europe, through the workings of Ibn Rushd, who had an enormous amount of influence on Thomas Aquinas, and Ibn Bajjah and Ibn Tufail, who invented the idea of the social contract, which Rousseau then adopts and makes it work for his own tradition, and Ibn Aqil and the various Muslim thinkers who said that it is quite dangerous to make good and bad depend on the divine command and nothing beyond the divine command, because the divine command in and of itself is represented through human will. And they believe that God placed God's self, God's what they call sifatullah, the attributes of God, into God's creation. And that the way that you discover good from bad, light from darkness, is that you study divine creation to understand the attributes of divinity, which then become the basis for natural rights. When the Islamic civilization, however, becomes an imperial power, and as the story goes on, it expands even into Europe and has a larger and larger number of people under its control, often in outright military occupation. The idea of natural rights eventually gives way to the notion of divine command only as revealed through the text. And it is the experts of the text that then interpret the divine command and rationalize it and justify it. In many ways, this dynamic is hardly surprising because we see this repeated pattern in civilizations between intellectual flexibility, if you will, the tradition of humanism, if you will, a tradition of openness, or a tradition of which is my name. I can't remember what my name is. Abou El Fadl, father of courtesy, or father of that giving nature of thought, and as people and empires become and states become intoxicated with their own power and are increasingly feel a sense of moral righteousness in whatever they do, they close up and they increasingly make morality defined by an elite group of people that act as the guardians and protectors of the truth and make the truth ever more exclusive. And in this case, in the Islamic case, it was the guardians of the text known as Ahl al-Hadith, which eventually take the form of the Wahhabis of today, and the dominant puritanical school that spread through Saudi Arabia and so on and so forth. But it is not a coincidence that the same school that reaches its ultimate logical conclusion in the form of the Puritanism of Saudi Arabia occurs at a time in which Muslims collectively experience their greatest level of political insecurity, and that also ends up generating the very practice of terrorism. And the cycle here, I think, in itself, the historical cycle, is divine. It's as if it's a divine lesson and a divine instruction that the people who started out by being the bearers of the truth through monopoly of the divine command end up being the people who ultimately justify terrorism and darkness, this evil that I mentioned at the beginning, and vis-a-vis, again, people who are raising broader principles. Now, but at the same time, stepping outside the Islamic tradition, we cannot forget that the natural law, natural rights, and yes, the human rights tradition has been used and abused in our modern age repeatedly to justify everything from forms of slavery to colonialism, imperialism, forms of paternalistic political interventions, and so on and so forth, and that it provided the moral righteousness to, in fact, do away with what I will argue is the basis of, ultimately, the basis of, whether in Islam or outside of Islam, is the basis of what defines the good or the divine or the beautiful, in my thought, and that is the voluntariness and the rational choice itself. So quite often in the history of, in the modern age, whether in every political intervention that destroyed the cultures, native cultures of peoples, or forcibly converted them, or forcibly destroyed their language, their heritage, or worse, just simply killed them or exploited their resources, ultimately there's always that ultimate element of denial of choice vis-a-vis the other, because you know best, you will know better. And here is where something that we often overlook in the human rights tradition in our contemporary age, which I see as parallel to the move from a school of natural goodness to a school of goodness strictly through revelation. The transition in human rights in the modern age from a model of a fairly open model of a search for the natural good to making human rights a product of a consensus between sovereign states. In other words, a positive law theory where states negotiate what is or what is not a human right. And then once states reach an agreement through either the Civil Covenant for Political Rights or the Economic Covenant or the Universal Declaration or what have you, whatever instrument it is, then that is textually declared to be what the right is, and it justifies, even at times, a violation of principle. Let me give you an example of what I mean by this. As you know, I served on the Commission for Religious Freedom, and my experience on that commission, I consider it extremely educational, extremely memorable, but also extremely bruising and sobering. The commission itself is established on lofty, what I call natural law principles, the idea of liberty and national choice, and the idea that it is fundamental that a human being be able to choose their faith, the faith that they believe in, they want to adopt, and so on. But during my service with this commission, it had become quite obvious that it functioned as a political instrument to exploit the principle, the rational principle itself, for entirely political causes. And without going into all the details, but basically, the commission was dominated by a group of what I view as right-wing Christians who could only see religious liberty in one direction, and that is, they are concerned only when Christians are oppressed or persecuted, and entirely fine and not bothered when those persecuted are of another faith. We had these taboo subjects like religious persecution in Israel, something that the commission would never touch. We were repeatedly told that it's one of the untouchable subjects, not because of any principle, not because of any empirical data, but because of what Israel is and the various political interests that defend Israel as a matter of principle. The commission, of course, was more than happy to condemn repeatedly Saudi Arabia or Iran, etc., but in every situation we confronted where we can balance out and some of you might know that eventually, actually a Muslim and a Jewish students end up suing the commission for religious discrimination and so on, which is one of the truly wonderful episodes where principles upheld. A Muslim applies for the commission for work, then a Jewish intern informs that Muslim that she was excluded because of her faith, and that she received instruction that there are instructions not to hire certain types of Muslims in the commission, and then that Jewish student ends up playing a very critical role in bringing out the truth about what was going on in the commission, and then it receives news coverage, etc. But what I was struck with during that experience is that in the commission itself, our debates, our discussions had turned boringly legalistic and textualist. We were constantly debating whether the particular language that we find in the Covenant for Civil and Political Rights included was whether religious persecution included the refusing to give visas for groups to enter to do evangelical work, whether that the text included banning or objecting to evangelical work in the context of a foreign occupation, because under the Geneva Convention and there is a textual tension between the Geneva Convention and the Covenant for Political and Civil Rights. And quite often, this textualism reminded me of the loss of the moral vision about what is supposed to be represented by the principle of religious liberty itself, or religious freedom. So, and time again, when you attempt to raise the essential point between the crux of what defines obligation, which is the ability to rationally choose. So, in other words, in situations where people are free to choose, you can say that we analyze a right in a certain way, but when people are not free to choose, then we analyze rights in a different way, was completely lost and nearly throughout the whole experience, even, I would say, among people from the State Department who, again, got lost in the legal language itself. Now, there is a critical issue. I've mentioned reason and rationality and so on. Well, let me clarify this point because it's an essential part of my argument tonight. And what the human rights in the contemporary sort of social contract methodology of human rights, what sometimes I call the Rousseau model of human rights, the negotiation between states that creates a written text posed as a challenge to the human rights community, the faith communities, is, well, if states can negotiate the text and produce the text and draft the text, why do we need God for the human right tradition, right? A very familiar question, or should be familiar to all of you. Well, we have human rights. What does God add to this dynamic? And as I'm sure those of you who learn or teach ethics will know, that God, the divine source, plays a very critical role in creating that notion of obligation, so that obligation coming through divinity becomes an acceptance of grace, an acceptance of mercy, an acceptance of goodness, an acceptance of a blessed state, rather than simply compliance with formal legal mechanism or the instrumentalities of law. So in other words, positive law, negotiated law, textual law cannot create a state of grace, cannot create a state of peace, cannot ultimately create a state of light to represent the goodness of human rights. It can only mimic the state of grace, or the state of light, or the state of divinity. Let me approach it from, my students often complain that that they struggle to understand my theories, but so let me approach it from a different way. Rousseau has a very famous passage, or I should say memorable passage, because I don't know how famous it is. Rousseau, the fellow who wrote The Social Contract, was responsible for an idea that has come to mark perhaps all the secular tradition in Europe, particularly countries like France, and that's the idea of civic religion. And Rousseau, in a passage that's quite fascinating, he says, in principle, we need gods, not men, to make law. Now, Rousseau wasn't actually advocating a role for the church. What Rousseau was saying, in the idea that we need gods, not men, was that law is so difficult that, and the whole quote goes on to say, we need men who are able to see into the future, we need men who are able to be objective, we need men. So basically he's creating a theoretical construct of the lawmaker as divine-like without being actually divine.